like perhaps many of us here, this year really broke me. It broke me in unexpected ways. But I come into the start of a new year, of 5785, with a hope I haven't felt in quite some time. Let me tell you why. I want to tell you a story that is both grand and historic and also very personal for me. A few weeks ago, my aunt in Israel died after a long illness. Doda Rivka, as we called her, was the last of the generation of my father's family who witnessed the pre-state history of modern Israel. Although her passing marks the end of an era, the story of her resilience and of my father's inspires me in hope for the future in this difficult time we find ourselves in today. Not long ago, one of the high school students that I teach in our religious school mused about having lived through the educational disruptions of COVID. And he said, "Could we please not live in unprecedented times?" I do understand that. That word, unprecedented, seems to be the journalist's favorite term these days, and I'm not even talking about the election. The truth is, though, whether we like it or not, we are living through extraordinary changes in our world. And far too often we treat these changes without a sense of history, without an anchoring in the complicated interactions from which they can. Sometimes we even make up false narratives which tie complex realities into some simplistic narrative of origin, which does more to obscure than to reveal. And this has been particularly true regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict over the past many decades, which has been greatly heightened and disturbingly simplified since the horrors of October 7th and the war in Gaza that has brought such destruction and pain to Israelis and to Palestinians over this past year. And we American Jews who sit so far away from the daily realities of this war are still deeply affected as rising anti-Semitism has come disguised sometimes as anti-Zionism, leaving many of us feeling battered and confused. Truly, these are, whether we like it or not, unprecedented times. My daughter Rivka's death brought me back to a memory of the world in Israel and Palestine that her life and the life of my father encompassed. They were both born in Tzfat, in northern Israel, where the Jewish community has had a remnant that never left the land. Jews remained there through the expulsion by Rome, the wars by the Crusades. The Jewish cemetery in the old city of Tzfat has graves dating back to the late centuries before and after the beginning of the Common Era. My own family has many generations of graves in that cemetery. On the first day of the year, in the year 1837, there was an enormous earthquake which devastated the Jewish and the Arab communities of Tzfat. My ancestor of 3 generations, Rabbi Levi Yehuda Cahana, was sent by one of the Hasidic European rabbis to help to rebuild that Tzfat community. 100 years later, the Jewish community began to expand, not from Jews escaping Europe, although there was that, but from a massive immigration of Jews expelled from Arab lands, a story which is not very well told. These Arabic-speaking Jews had a natural relationship with the Arab inhabitants of the land, as well as with the Yiddish-speaking European Jews already there. In the last years of the 19th century, the inhabitants of Palestine, Jews and Arabs, were actually united in a struggle against the waning power of the Ottoman Empire, which still had control and ownership over the land. The 20th century saw a European competition for power over the land of Palestine and throughout the Middle East. Today, my Muslim friends and I trace the great sin of the colonial West in that region to a secret treaty that was made back in 1916 between two European diplomats, the British Mark Sykes and the French François-Georges Picot. This famous Sykes-Picot agreement, later ratified by their respective governments, divided up the Middle Eastern countries of the Ottoman Empire between Western powers, ignoring all the historic and ethnic identities of the region. This blatant colonialist land grab would have profound effects on the region and the world, and would ultimately lead to great tragedy in my own family. In 1920, the League of Nations gave Great Britain the mandate to administer Palestine and Transjordan, and to put into effect the Balfour Declaration's commitment to a national home for the Jewish people, alongside the Palestinian Arabs. But as was usual for the British colonialists, the authorities found it easier to control the population by pitting one ethnic group against the other. The common enemy of the Ottomans was forgotten as Palestinian Arabs and Jews began to fight each other. In March of 1938, during a period that was known as the Arab Revolt in Palestine, 100 years after my family had first arrived, my grandmother, Tzipora, along with her mother, and my then 3-year-old Aunt Rivka, my father's youngest sibling, were riding in a taxi to a wedding in Haifa. As the taxi was traveling along the Akko Safat road with Jewish license plates, it was attacked by an Arab gunman who killed the driver and brought the car to a stop. He then approached the taxi and shot point blank the adult passengers within. My grandmother's body fell on the little 3-year-old Rivka and shielded her from the assassin's view. A passing car stopped behind the taxi and scared the shooter away, ultimately saving my aunt's life. The murder was newsworthy and was only one example of violence being perpetrated by Arabs against Jews and by Jews against Arab and British against both at the same time. But in the town of Tzfat, the murder galvanized the Jewish community in outrage. The funeral was a major affair, and anger was in the air. My father was a 16-year-old yeshiva student at the time, living away from home when he got the terrible news. They had no radios in the yeshiva, but in town, he heard the names of those killed. He heard his mother's name. He heard his grandmother's name. He came home to participate in their burial, along with family from all over the country. And this is how my father told the story of what happened next. And he told this story in a video that I recorded shortly before the end of his life, so I was able to get this story in his own words. As we walked in the funeral, he said, of course, the streets, it was Jewish streets where Jews lived, everything was closed. All of a sudden, we saw an Arab, a young fellow. I was very frightened, very concerned with him. People could tear him apart. So I went to him. I took out from my pocket any money that I had. It wasn't too much. But everything that I had, I gave to him as tzedakah. And when the people saw me crying, giving to him tzedakah, they let him go. They went away. Now, this story that I heard not too many times because my father didn't like to talk about his past. But I'm pleased that he spoke it in the recording and I was able to share this with my family. This story my family holds very close. A teenage boy whose mother had just been murdered by Arab terrorists refused to let that hate be perpetuated to an innocent bystander. Although he would grow up and fight for Israel's independence against the British colonialists, my father never in his life let his personal tragedy foment a hatred for Arabs. He believed at that time that if the British would be forced to leave, the Arabs and the Jews would find a way to work out their differences. Sadly, his optimism and his hope has not yet borne fruit. Over the past more than 80 years, there has been terrible violence committed against both sides. Extremist Arabs and extremist Jews have kept the conflict simmering. Arab terrorists have murdered Jews, and the national aspiration of Palestinian Arabs has been violently quashed by settlers and an increasingly powerful and nationalistic Israeli government. My father rarely talked about his experiences before the War of Independence, but I remember when I was a rabbinic student walking through the streets of Jerusalem with him. There were moments when he would suddenly stop, and he would point out, for example, a balcony where he and Menachem Begin would give an address to the people. His dream of a free nation for the world's Jewish community was long and painful in coming. But its reality galvanized Jews around the world, and it has given us hope. From my father, I have inherited a love for the Jewish state of Israel, not always for its governments, just like here in America, but always a love of the land, a love of the nation, a hope for an empowered Jewish identity and independence that Israel represents. That Zionist idea of a reborn Jewish national homeland living in peace alongside its neighbors is a dream begun and not yet fulfilled. But that hope has sustained us wherever Jews have lived. About 40 years after my father's ancestor first arrived in 19th century Palestine, there was a young Hebrew language poet named Naftali Herz Imber who penned a poem while living in Romania. Imber wandered around Eastern Europe, and he finally settled in Ottoman Palestine. By the time he left there in 1888, a simple Hebrew poem that he had written, Tikvatenu, Our Hope, had become popular among early Zionist pioneers in the Jewish farming community of Rishon LeZion. It became merged with a melody from a popular Moldavian folk song, and the tune was renamed Hatikva, the hope. Od lo avda tikvatenu, Hatikva, bat shnot alpayim liot am chovshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. Our hope is not yet lost. The hope of 2,000 years to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. And, as I've said, that hope is not yet fully realized. While the Jewish people have built a remarkable reality in Israel, a thriving yet fragile democracy, a world medical, scientific, technology leader, a multicultural, multi-ethnic society unique in the Middle East. But we are not a free people in our land while violence and fear and war remain a constant threat. Only peace and mutual recognition and acceptance will bring the fulfillment of the 2 millennia-year-old dream. Although Hatikva was not officially adopted as the Israeli national anthem until, get this, 2004, it was sung back at the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, and in every Zionist Congress afterwards. It was adopted in the 18th Congress in 1933 as the Zionist movement's anthem, along with the now familiar blue and white flag. It has served as the unofficial and official Israeli national anthem since the founding of the state in 1948. Hatikva, the hope. The belief against all evidence. For 2,000 years, the hope was for an indigenous, forcibly exiled community to return to its ancestral homeland. And for the past 76 years, the hope, Hatikva, is that we can live together in peace with our neighbors and with the indigenous Arab Palestinian people who also trace their roots and their history to the land. The example of my father, who fought against colonialist occupiers but sought to find common ground with his Arab neighbors to recognize their humanity, that has guided me in my love for Israel. Hatikva, the hope, is that peace can be found when extremists on both sides who believe that the land is only for them, when extremists will not drive event, but the middle majority can stop and listen to the other, can respect each other's rights to life and dignity and freedom, when we can find a way to live side by side in 2 states for 2 people, that ultimately we can find peace. It must start with respectful listening, something that is in very short supply these days. I totally recognize that my story, the story of my family, my narrative, my family's journey is very different than the story of Arab Palestinians. Our stories, our histories, our narratives directly contradict each other. This is even truer today when Israel's justified need for security has come at the cost of so many Palestinian lives. After the evil and cowardly attack of October 7th, the thousands murdered, the hundreds still being held as hostages today on Rosh Hashanah, Israel's righteous goal to destroy Hamas's ability to ever attack again has left horrible devastation among Gaza's civilian population. And now that the war that Hamas wanted has expanded into Lebanon, and the driving force behind all of it, Iran, has for the first time become directly involved, it is hard to hear the stories of Palestinian loss. And the truth is, many Israelis don't hear those stories. Their media doesn't present it. Just as our media does not tell the story of Israeli pain and loss and displacement, or of Hamas's cynical and criminal use of its own population as human shields. Still, we do not find peace by denying each other's stories, but by listening to them. There are Israelis who see every Arab as a terrorist. And there are Palestinians who see every Israeli as an invader. In those narratives, there is no hope, only a brutal imposition of will. But the hope lies in those who will listen, who will give respect, who will offer dignity to the other. This kind of respectful listening is also exactly what is not happening on our American college campuses. It is not what is happening in our American politics. Our divisions dehumanize the other and make their life experiences irrelevant and unworthy of consideration. A few weeks ago, I was approached by a leader at a local college about the possibility of holding a public dialogue with a Muslim friend of my choosing on the history and situation of Israel and Palestine, to model respectful listening and sharing. We were more than willing, based on assurances of ground rules among the student participants, of respect and curiosity. But, as I was told, it was the professors who refused to allow the dialogue on their campus, and the organizers could not guarantee our safety, and so we canceled. This saddens me, but I have hope. This is a terribly charged time. Devastation and loss on the Israeli and Palestinian sides are beyond comprehension. But perhaps in time, a dialogue like ours can take place on a college, just as it could and it does in countless homes in Israel and Palestine. We see this conversation here. We see this kind of conversation as being rare or brave. But the people who live in the land, the people who are directly affected by the violence and the absolutism, so many of them do have these kinds of personal human connections. Those connections is where hope lies. The political and military reality has kept the region mired in old patterns. Iran and its proxies have consistently made clear that their only goal is Israel's destruction. This makes every crisis an existential crisis for Israel. And extremists on the Israeli side, many inspired by my own extended family, view domination, exile, and expansion as the only possible response. Absolutism, the view that it all belongs to me and I will never be safe until you are gone. This absolutism is a view that a minority on both sides share, but has kept us trapped for generations now. When I was young, my father's cousin, Mayor Cahana, yes, that Mayor Cahana, the founder of the Violent Jewish Defense League, Mayor Cahana would sometimes come on speaking trips to our hometown of Houston. On those occasions, my father would often attend the talks, and he would stand up in the audience and publicly argue with Mayor's extremist views. Now, my father was no peacenik. I was seen as the naive, radical leftist in my family, a tradition which my children now continue, being more left than I am. And they make me very proud. And still, although my father held his right-wing beliefs about Israel, he was at heart a humanist, and he rejected Meir's extremist views. I'm sure this was not easy for Meir, because he had always looked up to my father, who was known as Gadol, the great one in our extended family. So they would have their public arguments. The local newspaper would write a headline, Cahana versus Cahana, and then Meir would come back to our house for dinner, and they would laugh, and they would sing, and they'd have a lovely time together. I remember this so fondly. I remember this as an example of human and family connection, even in the face of deep public and policy disagreements. Today, sadly, I don't think we live in a political world where this can happen. We do not break bread with people we disagree with, even family. I've heard from so many people this year and before about the challenges in their own lives, about their own discomfort over Israel and Palestine, about their discomfort in having conversations with their family and with friends. But I do believe that respectful listening represents our best hope. Hatikva, a possibility. Human connection, conversation, appreciation for the humanity of the other, even when you disagree profoundly. This creates a path that denies absolutism. To the extremist, the only answer is, you must lose so that I can win. In fact, your losing is more important than my winning. And so there's no possible way that I can listen to you because you have nothing to say. But to the humanist, life is not a zero sum. To the humanist, my win, my gain at the expense of your pain is a loss that is an incomplete win. The humanist listens to the story of the other and asks to be heard as well. Together, the hope, hatikva, is that we can find a way to live together, to respect the dignity of the other, to see the humanity in the other. Despite our students' wishes, we do live in unprecedented times. The challenges are real. A rise in anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. A politics of dehumanization and growing authoritarianism in our country, and in Israel. Also bound up with extremist and authoritarian policies, is mired in a war for its survival, which could possibly extend for years. But I hold out hope. There is a pathway that is not immediate, but it is clear. It is a view of the world which does not seem to dominate, does not seek to dominate, but to negotiate, to see the humanity and the desire for dignity and peace which lie not with the extremists and their weapons of war, but in the eyes and the stories of others. Before Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, there was a growing awareness of Israel as taking place in a regional alliance led by Saudi Arabia. This so-called Sunni coalition was part of the impetus for Hamas in attacking Israel. And Iran's terrifying ballistic missile strike just yesterday made clear to the world the necessity for such an alliance. The war in Gaza has complicated, but not eliminated that path. But it will rely on a pathway for Palestinian rights and independence, a Palestinian state living at peace with a secure and strong Israel. At this moment, in the midst of war, there is no political or popular will in Israel or among Palestinians for such a path. That is understandable. But this is where American Jews can help our Israeli friends and family to take the long view, not to make demands on them, but to listen to them and to let them listen to us, to see a view that's hard to see when you're in the midst of it, a view that we have the privilege of seeing from a distance. It will take time, but I will not give up on the land and the people I love. My Aunt Rivka was the last of her generation in my family. A child who saw her mother murdered by terrorists, as ultimately happened to my father's cousin, Mayor Cahana. Rivka, who witnessed the birth of the Jewish state, who lived through wars for its protection, who died even as missiles from Houthi rebels being aimed in Eilat in southern Israel, where she lived far from the borders of Gaza or Lebanon. We are now in a new era. It is dark and obscured at the moment. But Hatikva, the hope, still lives. We who live far away from the war zone are still a part of bringing about this hope, a humanistic hope, acknowledging the truths of the other. As the prophet Zechariah said, Ela davrim asher ta'asu, dibru emet ish et re'ehu, emet umishpat shalom, shiftu b'sharechem. These are the things that you shall do. Speak the truth with your neighbor. Fulfill the judgment of truth and peace in your gates. May our hope be for truth with our neighbor and peace within our gates. Amen.